Can you really get better at anything? Well, when Scott Young announced that this was the title of his new book, I was really excited to read it. I had been a fan of Ultralearning, which I recommend. It has a funny line in here, at least I found it funny, for people who love memory techniques, which I'll leave it for you to explore. I think it's quite a telling line and a useful one when you think about it. And so we talked about Ultralearning when it came out and had a great conversation, so it was fun to get together with Scott again to talk about get better at anything. And I really wanted to focus on this word better. And then, since it's my podcast, I thought, why don't I just cut away this word any and focus on what is a thing? And the reason why I wanted to focus on getting better at a thing or understanding what a thing is not to really noodle on the meaning of words like, oh, well, it would take me 3 days to ask, or answer the question of what is a thing. And you may have heard people say that in our internet era where they couldn't possibly answer a question until they know what the word do means, etc. No, I wanted to focus on it because we often have to learn processes where the target is moving. So when you're an author of a book, for example, you're in a big process that involves sometimes more than 100,000 words while the market for your book is moving. So how do you get better at that sort of thing? Or if you're a YouTuber, the algorithms and stuff like that are always changing. So how do you get better at things that are not things? And I really enjoyed speaking with Scott about that, specifically because he is a established author and has a great growing YouTube channel himself, which I recommend that you check out and get subscribed to. In any case, it's a wide-ranging conversation with Scott Young, and I really appreciated his time, and I recommend Get Better at Anything quite highly, actually. As I told him, I think it's a finer book than Ultralearning, and one of the reasons why is I like science a lot. I am sometimes asking science skeptical questions, so to speak, or that might make me sound like I'm skeptical of science, but actually what I'm skeptical about is when science isn't scientific enough, which I think you'll see comes out in this discussion. Anyway, a few housekeeping matters at the end, because what better place to hide them except for at the end. Until then, without further ado, I give you Scott Young, author of Get Better at Anything. Did I get better at this introduction compared to my others? I don't know. You tell me. Scott, so good to speak with you again. And you got this new book, Get Better at Anything. So just as a general thing, for people who don't know you, say a little bit about yourself and maybe what is better.
I was going to start with the easy questions. Hey?
Yeah. I mean, I just keep thinking about it over and over and over again.
Okay. All right. Well, first introduction. So my name is Scott Young. I've written 2 books on learning, published with a traditional publisher, Ultralearning with 2019, which we had a conversation about probably shortly after that book came out. It was around that time. And then I most recently published this book, Get Better at Anything. I've been writing for like 20 years about learning. So you can go on my blog. There's like literally thousands of articles. I've done sort of intensive learning projects, deep dives into scientific literature. So it's really been a focus for me. I would say I keep coming back to it. So, I mean, we can go into a lot more. I can tell you about my childhood and whatnot if you want, but that would be the shorthand version of the introduction. And better, what is better? I mean, we're going to get real philosophical to start off. I think that better, I mean, in certain contexts, better is obvious, right? Like if we're thinking about like a sprinting time, or we're thinking about like, like like how quickly you could make some widget on a factory. Better is really simple. But in the real life, better is something that's like super multidimensional. Like there's lots of different ways you could measure quality of something. And sometimes, you're measuring something where you want a little mixture of things. And so I don't think there's a right answer to the question of what better actually means, but I think it is very much tailored to your goals and your interests. So, I mean, if we're even just taking something simple like speaking a language, better could be, having a wider vocabulary, or it could mean having a better accent, or it could mean that you are able to speak more fluently so that you're not having as many hesitations or pauses. Or, you can think of all these different dimensions that you could go on for language learning. And so, I mean, getting better is something that you have to decide what you're going to work on and what you're aiming toward. But I think the mechanisms of learning and understanding how they work, they tend to work for most of the dimensions. So I don't think there's I'll leave the problem to the philosophers, but I'm more interested in the how than the what.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Speaking of language, I mean, one of the things that I thought about when it comes to better is an unsolvable thing to me. And I think looking to the science is really fantastic, although I have some questions around that. But I thought of Heisig when I was reading this, and I don't know if you know Heisig, but he had like remembering the kanji, I think, and remembering the
Right,
hiragana
yeah.
and all this. And he had an idea in his mind of how to learn the characters better.
Mhm.
But when I read the reviews of those books, it was almost like 50-50. And so, I mean,
Yeah.
some people just get it and other people don't. And that sort of comes up in your book, this idea that, okay, so there's this evidence, but why don't the students pick it up? And so I thought of
Yeah.
Heisig a lot because I, as a mnemonist, can see what is maybe off, but it's almost an entrepreneurial better because I've got my shtick,
Mhm.
I'm another guy with something to
Yeah,
sell,
yeah.
sort of thing. But I also
Yeah, yeah.
legitimately think that there's an argument to be made. What is better in what Heisig is doing in his mnemonics? But there would still be this distribution. Like it's not going to hit
Yeah.
everybody. So that's part of what I had in mind by asking that
Yeah.
broad, what is better question
Well, I
when
mean,
you have that problem.
there's some pretty clear areas where like better matters a lot and like which thing you're aiming at. Like if you were saying like who's the better athlete, but you're like measuring people with like a tennis game and like, a swimming competition. And then, you got all these people practicing tennis and you're like, you know what, we're going to test them with the swimming competition. You're like, look, all that tennis practice didn't make them better athletes at all. Like, that's just a ridiculous situation, right? But
Right,
we do
right.
find ourselves in that sometimes where like in schools, we test people in one way and what we think of as better is in another way or in a more generic sense. And so there are all of these issues of measurement and assessment. But at the same time, I also think there are some like while there are kind of these forking path decisions of like you have to choose how you want to be better, there are a lot of things where the paths do converge and like the same thing that works for one thing also works for another thing. And so I guess the question I would ask for people who claim, okay, well, the evidence supports X being better for, learning some particular thing, but I disagree because I'm using some idiosyncratic measure of goodness. I would just say, great, standardize it and see if your thing actually works for that. I mean, the example that's coming up to mind a lot for me is a lot of the research that was done on reading. And here, phonics tends to show this advantage, particularly with lower background knowledge students. It tends to work better. But there were all these kind of like, I don't know, feel like these kind of esoteric objections that like, well, it's because of how they're measuring it or this kind of thing, like the things that you're bringing up, like, well, we're not just caring about, decoding fluency. We also care about like the love of learning or this kind of thing. And to my answer, I would just say like, great, make some kind of test where you're sort of asking, okay, how much do you enjoy reading books? How many books do you read in your spare time? All the like you could create those standards. And then if it turns out your method works better for one thing and another person's method works better for another thing, just like if we were measuring athleticism by tennis or swimming matches, and you're like, well, tennis coaching works for the tennis and swimming lessons work for the swimming competition. Then I think there would be a reasonable case to be made. But I think sometimes that kind of hand waviness, I don't really actually know that much about the remembering the kanji method, so I can't comment on that. But to me, I would feel like, sometimes that objection of what works better is grounded in like, well, this person's aiming for something different than what I want. But other times I think it's just this person like, oh, well, that way of doing it was more tedious or more effortful or something. And so I want to choose that I'm going to ignore that, there's some experiment that shows that it works better.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that tedious thing comes up a lot because
Yeah.
it's just a kind of reality in the world that some people just do want it easier. And I've
Mm-hmm.
had many emails, just can't you just spoon feed it to me? And then I thought, well, I probably could, but I predict it won't make a difference because
Yeah.
it's the attitude of
Yeah.
avoiding effort when I think you and I both know
Yeah.
that to get something remembered, you kind of got to lean into the challenge. I mean, that's part of the principle of active learning that has been studied quite well. That
Yeah.
if you don't like closed tests and so forth, I think you mentioned in
Yeah.
the book,
Yeah.
like that whole thing is challenge yourself, feel, maybe
Yeah.
this isn't the right way of wording it, but feel the
Yeah.
pain, lean into the discomfort. And that's part of the learning and the memory formation.
Well, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, like, as a general principle, our brains are like kind of designed to avoid cognitive effort if it's unnecessary, just like our bodies are designed to avoid unnecessary physical exertion.
Mm.
There's this really like funny anecdote. I was reading this book about exercise by the Harvard evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman, and he's talking about going to the I think it's the Academy of Sports Medicine or something like this. And there's some big conference where like everyone is like, exercise is medicine, exercise is really good. And so he and like some TA sat at the bottom of the stairs and escalator and counted how many people took the stairs. And he was like, it's only like 2 percentage points higher than the normal amount of people that take the stairs. And
Right.
so to me, like even people who are obsessed with exercise still take the escalator because, that's just what you do when you're walking there. And I think there's something similar with learning that, if your brain has this choice between, well, I can just look at the information and not retrieve it from memory, you don't retrieve it from memory because you don't need to. And even if the retrieving it from memory is a very important component process to strengthening the memory, or if you, like you said, like if you can just, if you can just do some way of avoiding the cognitive effort, then you often do that. I mean, there are some cases where the cognitive effort can be too high, and like we can talk about that as well. I thought that was very interesting research, but it is a general tendency that like passivity is the norm. The
Mm.
path of least resistance is the norm. And very often, if you want to go down the learning path, then you're just inevitably going to have to go through that. So yeah, I find these kind of like teacher reviews or people being like, well, I don't like this based on my subjective experience. I don't want to give it zero weight, but I do think it can be misleading because there's just so many studies that show that people tend not to prefer the things that work in a lot of these ways. And so
Mm.
I kind of say, well, if I were to really believe that, I would say, yeah, define your measurement of better that's different from how people are currently testing it. And like, give me some evidence that your thing actually delivers on that, because often it's just wishful thinking.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to stick to my special mnemonics thing, but that is a
Yeah, yeah,
problem in mnemonics, right?
yeah,
Like it's just unquestionable that it works.
yeah,
But what we don't know, and I sometimes joke, this is the Nobel Prize question. Like whoever
yeah,
figures out why people won't just use mnemonics
yeah,
and like take someone like Boris Conrad, who is both a well-established memory athlete and a neuroscientist, right?
yeah,
Like you're not going to take that guy's word for it. Like
yeah,
the Nobel Prize question really is like, why do people, and I guess it's already answered. It is the
yeah.
brain's disposition to saving energy and even the body's thing. I don't know if you remember the Savannah hypothesis. That was that kind of thing of, you know, we were we were not hunting all the time, but
Yeah.
rather sitting in the shade waiting for a lion to leave the carcass. And really, our athleticism came from running out and dragging it back
Yeah.
and saving maximum energy. But
Yeah.
one of the things you mentioned is that, you know, this. So, well, I think the surprising thing to me, the most surprising thing in the book, was the idea that, and I don't know if I understood it correctly, but that certain people, when they get to a certain level, they do much better with disorganized text.
Oh yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting experiment. I don't remember the principal author. I know that Walter Kinch was a co-author on it, but you can look it up. But basically, it was a text about, I think, the function of the heart. And so they gave two different versions. One version was like nicely organized. So there was like sort of like, headers and subheaders and like it was organized well. And the other one was sort of disorganized. And then you do like a post test to see how much the person has learned. And for most people, they better benefit more from the organized test. So that's not too surprising. But what was interesting is that the people who had higher knowledge, so they already maybe knew some things about the heart and organization and this kind of stuff, did better with the disorganized text. And the sort of argument in favor of this, and I don't want to say this is like a super practical advice, like, oh yeah, disorganized tests, that's generally leads to better learning. But the idea is that when you have the super organized text, you maybe read it, but you're not really thinking about what you're reading.
Mm.
Whereas Kinch and his colleagues were arguing that if you have the disorganized text, you actually have to form what he calls a situation model, which is basically just sort of a mental model of like, what is the text actually describing? And because it's sort of disorganized, you have to like retrieve some knowledge to like put that together and assemble, okay, well, how is it describing how blood circulates through the heart or what have you? And that act of creating the situation model is good for learning. And so for a person who doesn't have that much background knowledge, the disorganized text is too hard. Like they can't form the situation model. They can't make sense of what the text is saying. And so the more organized text is better for them. But for the people who are higher knowledge, then the super organized text, it's like they just kind of skim through it, like, yeah, I know that. And they're not actually like thinking through what is this text saying. So I do think that that can have an effect. I do think that like that idea that, you know, as we acquire more knowledge, we need to do more active kind of learning. We need to like think for ourselves, write for ourselves, you know, do this sort of situation model construction in our brain to deeply understand things. I think that's very important. It's probably not a good idea for teachers to just like needlessly complicate texts, but it is an important factor that like once you've kind of covered material, just seeing like more easy to read summaries of the material is maybe not so beneficial.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons why that leapt out at me. First of all, it was surprising to actually see any kind of confirmation on that in a study.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm making a mistake and making a category confusion here, but to me it made intuitive sense for a couple of reasons. And one is just I deal with a lot of people who are interested in Giordano Bruno. And I don't know if you know him, but he was a Renaissance mnemonist who was burned at the stake February 17th, 1600, because of his ideas about infinity and the implications of that. But he also wrote all these memory books. And they're very difficult memory books. They have the Ramon Lullian wheels and, you know, kind of like this proto-algebra calculus stuff. I mean, Leibniz even said that, you know, this was where he got a lot of his ideas out of these memory wheels. Anyway, they tell me I can't make head or hair or whatever. And I'm just like, I wish I could find books that are even harder to read than Bruno's, because I love so much to be challenged in that way. And it's not just memory books. Derrida, Zizek, you know, like I know to a lot of people, it's just like, this is absolute nonsense. But to me, there's an interesting book you might love, actually. It's called Just Being Difficult. And it's about this tension of like, if like, I don't even think Einstein actually said it, but this whole thing of like, if you really understand it, you should be able to say it simply. And to that I say, no, and 1,000 times no. Actually, they do say it quite simply, but there is something about the zen of it, if I can use that word, because it's not right. It's not right. But maybe I'm making a category confusion. But nonetheless, I look for books that are harder all the time. You know?
Yeah.
I put mustard on Gödel Escherbach, you know?
The situation that makes me think of, so like sort of like shortly after my son was born, we were kind of like entering the COVID pandemic, I somehow got onto reading Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. And in particular, there's this, he's now deceased, but there's this, I think he was Berkeley professor, Dreyfus, who had this sort of whole exegesis of Heidegger. Like this is the guy, he spent his entire life trying to make sense of Heidegger's philosophy and like talking about it. And so I was reading the book, which is truly inscrutable if you don't follow it along with something else. Like it's very, you're not going to understand. But I'm following this, I'm listening to Hubert Dreyfus talk about it. And the thing that I kind of really got from it, not even so much from my own sake, but from watching this Hubert Dreyfus guy who has clearly poured over this book more than I will pour over any book in my entire life. Like this has been his life's work, is to like focus on this book. And the thing that stuck out at me from it, and that like, it's not just the difficulty of Heidegger's thinking and like the sort of him deliberately choosing extremely obtuse ways of talking about things and, you know, like basically setting it up so it's very difficult to understand. But the kind of the effort that Dreyfus pours into trying to make sense of parsing exactly what he's saying, and like there's all the classroom discussions about it. Like it's clear that that active work that is building on this text is the learning. Like that is what it is. Like the text itself is only supplying like maybe a small amount of the ideas. It's him trying to interpret it and make sense of it. And no, he can't be meaning this. He must be meaning something else. Like it's all that work that I think is going into it. And I definitely think among, you know, interested, motivated, some might even say intelligent students, this process of having some source material that acts as this catalyst for your own thought processes and coming back to something and thinking about it and retreading the ground and looking at it from different positions. Like, I mean, just the accumulated mental benefit of like going over all those different paths is probably clear. It's maybe not the most efficient way to learn a particular skill, but it's definitely going to be a way that some people at least get this real deep expertise on something.
Right. Yeah, well, I think you'd really like if you had any flavor that you enjoyed of
Yeah.
Heidegger, you'd really like his commentaries on Nietzsche because that even
Yeah.
takes it into another level of vertiginous,
Yeah.
labyrinthian thought
Yeah.
puzzles. But I that's the only book I like from Heidegger actually is his commentary
Yeah.
on Nietzsche. But it's especially troubling and interesting and weird.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, how have you improved? How do you feel about your own progress? In what ways
Yeah.
is get better at anything or everything? Sorry, get better at
Yeah.
anything.
Get it or anything.
I'm
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
checking. Wait a second. Did I say that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like how is it in your mind better or is it?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of going back to that first point we were talking about, like, what does it mean to get better at something? And so, like, I'll use the process of writing the book because I think that's like the most direct one I can think about. So it was pretty clear to me that like one of the main things that I wanted to get better at was doing research. Because when I wrote Ultralearning, I definitely relied on the research, but I felt a little bit like I was skimming the surface. Like I would read some of the reviews, I would read to like, okay, there's this general idea, general point, you touch on a few studies, but I didn't feel like I was like hitting the bottom, so to speak, like where you're really like you feel like you know it inside and out. And so that was a major sort of um, kind of goal implicitly with working on a new book, is that I wanted it to be more research driven. I wanted to kind of get to that level that where I felt like, you know, I've seen all the different little nooks and crannies and stuff here. So that was one thing that I definitely felt like I improved upon. And the other thing I would say, and again goes to this dimension of betterness that we're talking about, that in a creative pursuit like writing, I think once you've gained a certain level of comfort and familiarity to it, it is hard to say what better is, because I mean, you could judge it by sort of external markers of success, like how many books you sell, although to that I would say ask any person to go pluck random like, mega bestsellers and tell me whether it's actually the best writing. That's often not the case. Or similarly, like award-winning books, but I've also become a little bit jaded about that too, because I feel like sometimes books win awards because they just happen to like tickle the particular interests of like some narrow subset of literati. So if you get rid of those external markers, what does it mean to get better as a writer? And I don't think that there's a single answer to that question, but I do think that there is the idea of improving along a self-set dimension. So you have some idea of, this is a quality that I'd like to bring out in my creative work that either I'm not able to do right now, or I'm not able to do to the extent that I'd like to, and then you can pursue it. And whether that results in, external creative success is another thing. But I think, that's the essence of craft, of like sort of self-setting, this is what I take to be better and I'm going to strive for it. So for this particular book, one of the things that I wanted to discipline myself as a writer was to try to rely less on my own opinionating while I was doing things, because I felt like that was a little bit of a weakness or a crutch that I had relied on in the past. That, my experiences from writing blog articles, which is this very first person opinionated kind of format. And it had this sort of sense of like, well, whenever I couldn't get evidence to back up my point, I would just like state it emphatically and then, just hope that you agree with me already. Whereas I thought it would be interesting to write a different kind of book where like I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to remove myself a little bit and try to be like, this is what I read. This is what seems to be true from like what I'm pulling out from beneath. Now, whether or not you think that's a better style, I think is that's a subjective question, but it is something that I was striving for in writing this book.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a different style in my mind or in my memory. I didn't
Yeah.
go back to the previous book, but one thing that did leap out at me is that it was a different style in my memory
Yeah.
anyway. And I kind of was waiting for when drawing was going to come up, or more
Yeah.
on language learning or an MIT
Yeah.
thing or something like that. But it just
Yeah.
wasn't there.
Yeah.
And there's no sort of, and this is not at all a bad thing, but there's no
Yeah.
sort of like grand crescendo where it sort of comes to a thing. It's just this wonderful citations, which are great to have as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say it doesn't come to a grand crescendo. It comes to a great summary, but you know what I'm saying? Like it almost,
Yeah.
it's a science book in a way, I guess. And then,
Yeah, I think it ended up being that. I feel like maybe that's all my own like this genre. I think sometimes you have like people have expectations. I think definitely that's one thing. I think when you're doing creative work and you're trying to do something better, is that people kind of always want you to play your greatest hits. And I think
Mhm.
as someone who creates things, you have to resist that somewhat. I don't want to say that you should just like completely ignore what has worked for you in the past and like just sort of throw it in the garbage. But I think if you pay too much attention to that voice that sort of says like, "Oh, do this again," then you forget that like what people liked when you did something the first time was that it was new. I don't know. I think about that in the context of whenever they do like reboots of like television series or movies in Hollywood, and the fan base is like kind of almost always disappointed with what actually comes up. Like there's exceptions, but they're almost always like, oh, this is the worst. But it's because they want something that's actually impossible. They want something that is both exactly the same as how they remember the original, but also feels fresh the way it did when they saw the original the first time. And you cannot do those two things, right? And so
Mm.
I think that's one of the things that, like, as someone who makes things and writes and does this kind of work, um, I'm aware of that tension. I'm aware that, like, there's some things that you did in the past that people really like, and they're kind of, oh, do that again. But I think what I want to do in my life is to do a lot of different things. And then sometimes people will like them and sometimes people won't, but they'll, when I do make something new, hopefully it'll be like, oh yeah, this is really good. Forget about all that stuff you did in the past. So that's what you're aiming for, I think, when you're making stuff.
Yeah. No, I personally, I think this is a finer book. I wouldn't use the word better. It's a finer book.
Yeah.
But I did miss that there wasn't kind of
Yeah.
a personal update, which is, neither here nor there at the end of the day,
Mhm.
especially if people are reading it cold and they don't
Yeah.
really know your previous stuff or your blog or what
Yeah.
have you. Um, you mentioned awards, and I don't know if you've read it, but just for anybody who's interested, I'm reading Murakami's Novelist as Vocation now, and he has
Oh,
a very interesting essay on awards and his thoughts about awards and stuff like this. And
oh, I should
also,
watch it. I just finished. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say I just finished his what I talk about when I talk about running. I think was his. I just finished it while I was doing my like daily jogs
right,
and
right.
stuff.
Well,
I should
it's
revisit that
interesting
Murakami
what
book.
you
Yeah,
said, in terms
yeah,
of wanting to do new things and so forth. Because the next
yeah.
essay, I think it's the next one after the one on awards, is about creativity, and
Mhm.
he's sort of grappling with that tension that you just mentioned, and in
Yeah,
terms of what is better, but he almost looks at it differently. I just read it last night. I haven't memorized
yeah,
any of the points verbatim, but he's like, the first thing is it has to immediately have its own voice. Like you have to know that
yeah.
this is its own thing, and then it has to wrap you back into the previous thing. Anyway, it's just
Mm.
his opinions, but
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
No, I
uh,
mean it's interesting. I definitely respect someone's work like that, but I don't know. I also because his running book is also kind of part novelist memoir at the same time.
mm,
I thought it was very interesting because you can see this kind of, I think, successful artistic types. You kind of have to cultivate a little bit of a detachment from the public reception of your works. And I talk about this a little bit in this book, just the sheer randomness involved. And so it can be kind of brutal if you're trying to like do that. But I think there's also something kind of immiserating if you're like aiming for hits. I read this profile of Psy, the Gangnam Style guy,
all
about how
right.
like since Gangnam Style came out, he has like spent his career trying to replicate this sort of like brief shining flame where he was the most famous, person on earth for this brief moment, and he was like struggling to do that. And I just thought, you know, there's almost a kind of melancholy quality to it that like this is a person who achieved a level of musical recognition that for most of us we are never going to even get close to, and yet he's spending the rest of his career grasping for that rather than being like, what, that was nice that I had that chance to do that. Like what interests me about music, what would I like to make? It's sort of like how do I figure out how to like deconstruct and re-engineer that same success. And
Mm,
I think about, I like none of my books, like Ultralearning did okay, but it wasn't like, oh, I'm now going to be living off the royalties for the rest of my life. But I think about that sometimes. I have some friends that have just had like spectacular successes, and I don't know how they approach it, whether it's stoically or with this kind of sigh like nostalgia for it. But I do think it can be this like sort of um, triumph as well as a curse, because when you have something that's that successful, like everything you do after that is going to be like implicitly weighed against that benchmark. And it can be, it can be a bit of a tether too, even though, yeah, it's nice to, sell 1 million copies of your books or something like that.
Right, right. Yeah, it is such a tension. And I think it relates to at least some people in the learning space who need to pass exams and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But before I dig into questions around that kind of thing, who is this book for primarily in your mind? I was like, is this for
Yeah.
teachers? Is it for
Yeah.
the student in university? Is it because I mean, I think it's for all those people, but I wonder
Yeah.
if you because they say write for one
Well,
person, and I wonder if you had
Well,
that
the book I
in
wrote,
mind.
like if I'm being honest, the book was written for me, so that's like super self-centered if I say it. But like this book is the book that I wanted to read. This is the book that like I did an enormous amount of work to kind of like dig through a lot of the research and try to understand this. And like I was interested in how learning works in kind of our basic theories of how these things are. What are some of the like key kind of concepts and touch points? And so to me, I feel like this is the kind of book that I would have liked to have had as a guide, as a reference for learning things. I mean, I think that just naturally speaking, given using myself as an example, that I think this leans toward the person who is the learner. Like I spend more of my time talking about how you can learn things rather than how you can teach things. But definitely one of the major things that I uncovered was just like how big a role teaching plays in a lot of these kinds of domains, and how there is this kind of knowledge bootstrapping problem, which like we talked about the necessary element of active learning on part of the student and how frustrating it can be for teachers when the students are passive. But the reverse of the problem is also there, that if the student is hungry for knowledge, but they cannot easily acquire it because it's, locked inside the heads of experts, or it's sort of, written in these sort of confusing ways, or it's hard to access because of social networks, that itself can be a major barrier to progress. And so I thought that that was also sort of an interesting element that I wanted to bring to the surface in this work, that like, especially when you get outside of the classroom, so much of learning does depend on, your social connections and the relationships you form with other people, and that social aspect of it can't be ignored.
Right. One thing I kept thinking about while I was reading it is, do you think people go to university when they're too young?
Mm. I don't know. I think it would be nice if there was some kind of like midlife return to school, or even, even better if there were just a kind of a culture of, uh, being, especially when you're sort of, maybe you've busted your butt trying to get your career and you've achieved something, that there was some kind of like expectation that you would go and get that kind of liberal arts education on the side that you were always supposed to. I don't know. I think, maybe it's just not plausible given our kind of current organization of society, where like there is this sort of, you work really hard to make this enormous fixed investment in skills and knowledge and stuff, and then you get like thrown into the working world. But I mean, I don't know. I think it would be more humanistic to do it that way. I definitely try to live that way, where I, want to be a perpetual student. And, even if I'm not attending college classes, I'm always trying to read books and learn things, and, trying to do the stuff that maybe I should have covered in college, but I didn't.
Well, one thing that's on my mind is, and I say this maybe in a way that sounds different than I mean it, but I'm going to say it this way anyway.
Sure.
Why should we take these scientists seriously? I mean, they
Yeah.
often don't have the skills that they're studying, and I mean,
Hmm.
I'm always surprised that there aren't more people like Boris Conrad, who I mentioned, like Nemesis, who have
Yeah.
PhDs and budgets to brain scans and so forth. But and I partly feel this way because I do a lot of scientific research myself,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's time consuming just to find access to, my wife finished her PhD and I don't have access
Hmm.
to her university library anymore, right? So there's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
all this paywalled stuff, right? And then when you do
Hmm.
find some of the more open things, you often find, well, actually this is studied on 3 people or 10 people. I didn't
Yeah.
go and follow all. I
Yeah.
didn't have time to follow all of your resources,
Yeah.
but it feels like we're in a time which I don't agree with, but
Mhm.
it can't not influence me. We're in a time
Yeah.
of science skepticism, and there might be some
Yeah.
good reason for it. That kept coming to my mind.
So, yeah. So, okay. So, lots of things to unpack. I have lots of thoughts on this. So, first, there's a kind of like, I would call it like the practitioner versus researcher debate that is, especially in this kind of self-improvement thing. It's sort of like if you're getting fitness advice, should you get it from like the schlubby Harvard professor, or should you get it for like the guy who's just jacked at the gym? And
Mm.
I tend to think this is a kind of, I do, first of all, think that these images are less dichotomous than they appear. Like, I mean, I got to talk to a lot of researchers, and we're talking about like people who are in the education system, and they are, almost without a doubt, like incredibly smart, well-educated people. Like, these are not just like, oh, I'm like a dum dum, but I just decided to do this. No, they loved education, and that's why we went into it. So that would be one thing. Um, I really like speaking of languages, I really like Victor Marr, who has the language log, and he's very much an academic, and he talks about this. But not only is he an academic, like his linguistic knowledge and historical knowledge and all this kind of stuff is just vast. So like he's clearly someone who is very much both a researcher and a practitioner, I guess you could say, of whatever he's trying to learn. So I don't think the distinction is quite so sharp. Um, I do think that there's probably some areas where someone can have an academic specialty in a fairly narrow research area. And then from that narrow research area, kind of make broad generalizations that don't always make impact with the world because of practical consequences. So I do think sometimes, if you're reading a study, I do think it's good to have that little voice in your head that's saying, well, but how well does this generalize? Is this true? Like we just talked about the paper, the heart paper, where it was like disorganized and that led to better retention. I mean, I think the proper takeaway from that thing is like, well, is this actually a practical effect that you see in school materials frequently?
Yeah.
And I would say that, probably not. Probably the idea that like it's safe to say that in most cases, the better organized text is going to be better to learn from for most people. Um, the second thing is about science skepticism. And I think I have some mixed thoughts on that. So the first thing I would say is that I think you're right, and I think that some of the science skepticism comes from not being able to see the totality of the field. Like if you just throw off like an individual paper, and especially I don't know, I find this when I read a lot of books that are not really academic books. They're just written by people like me who are interested in a topic. And very often what they do is they like find some opinion that they have, and then they go find some study that like seems to support that opinion, and then they cite it, and then you're supposed to take that as evidence that, well, that they're correct. And I just think like if that's your approach to doing things, or if that's the person you're reading is that's their approach, well then like of course you're not going to get any like useful knowledge from that, because it's not whether or not you can find something that sort of suggests that your opinion is right. It's sort of like, well, you've read a huge amount of information, and like the aggregate conclusion seems to be X. So I think there's just sort of like a problem with interpreting science. So for the lay public, I mean, I would say that when you read level-headed books written by academic experts where they just sort of cover the research and say, well, this is what we know about this. I don't think that you get a misleading picture. I think that is like kind of what experts think about it. And then there'll be some things that experts don't have an opinion on because there's not a lot of research, and there'll be some things that they do have an opinion on. And then the final thing about like whether or not we should trust them. I mean, it is an open question. Although I do think that I do think you get a kind of smell test for like some kinds of scientific results are probably kind of fishy. Like, yeah, that doesn't smell. But a lot of the boring stuff, a lot of the mechanistic stuff, I mean, this stuff was figured out, 70, 80, sometimes 100 years ago. And there's been lots of attempts and follow-ups and like people looking at it from different angles, and people still sort of agree that that's the way to think about it. So for that kind of research, I'm much less skeptical. Like, if someone were to say to me, "Oh, well, someone found out, it did a study that if you play, Chopin in the classroom, it improves brain scores by like 15%." I'd be like, I don't know, I don't know. But if someone were to say to me, "Oh, the spacing effect, we shouldn't believe that because those scientists, those none of their experiments replicate," I would just be like, "Okay, okay." All right, slow down here because we're talking about two different things.
Mm.
Also, the other thing too is that like, what alternative do we have? I mean, I think there's this idea that like, well, science doesn't replicate, so therefore we should rely on. And then the thing that they're suggesting is invariably like has all the flaws that we're talking about replication, like personal experience, all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, I could
Mm.
go in a whole rant in this direction, but I do think there's an
Yeah.
overcorrection away from science.
Well, I think so too. But that said,
Yeah.
I'm not a science skeptic myself at all. If
Yeah.
anything, I mean, I think I'm one of these rare people who read Popper, and maybe I misread him, but when I read Popper, the thing that leapt out at me was that falsifiability itself must be must be subject to
Mhm.
the principle of falsifiability. Like that's
Yeah.
how scientifically driven I am. It's like let's falsify
Yeah.
falsifiability, right? But where I see something, there was a book by this title, Tyranny of Metrics.
Yeah.
So one thing that I find very worrying is, yeah, okay, the science says this, right? But when
Yeah.
we're going to have now minimal guidance studies
Yeah.
go against human nature, where is freedom to fail? Where is like,
Yeah.
because I mean, this is a silly thing to say, but not so silly. When is
Yeah.
the AI going to just produce exoskeletons that jump on you and say, this is how you write cursive, right?
Yeah.
Like, where's the freedom to fail? It's almost like, so what? So what? The spreadsheet says that. Where's my freedom to fail?
Well, I mean, there is always the freedom to fail. I guess like
Well, right
that's
now there
just
is.
always a choice we could have. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think if we're like if you're specifically talking about like the Sweller Kirchner, like this argument in favor of strong instructional guidance. I have interesting thoughts on that because I think that, like, well, first of all, one of the main things I think you have to derive from this information in context is that often in the school system, we are dealing with students who aren't really that self motivated. They don't really want to learn what you're teaching them. And so, in that case, I mean, it kind of makes sense that the more strongly you tell them, do this practice, and you like remove the degrees of freedom, the more likely they're going to learn what they want to learn. So I think there's even just a kind of wishful thinking on the path of like some, educational pundits that like, every student is like they were just like bright and curious and eager to learn. And like most
Mm,
students are like bored in the classroom. They're barely paying attention. So if you don't like get them to go through the mental steps that they're required to acquire the skill, they don't acquire the skill. Now, whether or not we should be forcing students to learn that, to me, that's a whole separate discussion. It's just sort of like in the classroom, you're going to spend some time teaching. That seems to be something that's beneficial, at least for a lot of students. I don't want to say that I think that like the Sweller, Kirchner, Clark, the people who have that argument, it's ironclad. But I do think they raise a good point, which is that when you're learning new skills, one of the major bottlenecks is if I have difficulty understanding the skill, if I have difficulty understanding what are the steps that I'm supposed to take and what I'm supposed to like generalize from this, that is going to be a bottleneck for learning. And particularly for complicated subjects, it seems like it's one of the major bottlenecks. Like
mm,
we often underappreciate how difficult a lot of skills are when we're first approaching them. Like again, the research on phonics is like probably a paradigmatic example of this, that like we're all fluent readers. I'm assuming most people who are listening to this are fluent readers. So we neglect like how complicated the act of like seeing little black squiggles on the page is, and like just hearing prose in your head. Like the cognitive machinery that needs to be developed for that to happen is quite sophisticated. And yes, some students are clever and they manage to figure it out, but this sort of like, because it's opaque, because it's not clear what a reader is doing when they look at the page and then they make the sounds out. If you can break it down, if you can show the steps, if you can have the examples, if you can work through the practice, that will produce better results for students. So I don't think it's so much a freedom to fail as it is a like, realizing that this is a major obstacle to learning. And if we can resolve it, I mean, it can solve some problems, not all the problems associated with learning.
mm. Yeah, as I say, I'm being a bit purposely dramatic, but this is where knowledge of Heidegger comes in
Yeah.
handy. I mean, the Geworfenheit into the world and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how meaning gets made and how meaning gets unmade in some sense. That's just maybe an anxiety that's on my mind, especially since I don't know how you feel, but I'm just thinking as I watch AI text, and it's just like, oh man, I gotta like
Yeah.
really up my game here. But then at the same time, my writing feels even better than before. but worse. Like it's paraconsistent, if I can use that term. It's better and worse. My human writing, and so that's also a kind of thing where I have to use the AI even though I don't want to, just to be able to get better at my own writing, because it's weird. It's like a reflection, but it is a Geworfen Heideggerian sort of sense. It's like, how are you going to make meaning out of this?
Well, I think that's one of the things that I kind of took as a takeaway as well, is that, like, assuming you are this sort of bright, curious person who wants to teach themselves things and wants to learn in the world, I think in some ways the fact that we live in an era where access to information is so widespread, like, it really is the age where it's like the age of the autodidact. This is the age where if you have that motivation and ability, you can learn anything you want, which would not have been true through most of human history, which I think is just something that we don't fully appreciate. That, I mean, when I did that MIT Challenge project, that was sort of my epiphany at the time, is a sort of like, until fairly recently, yes, you could learn these subjects by going to the library or whatnot. I don't want to say that it was literally impossible, but until very recently, the idea that you could just be like, oh, well, this is what an MIT student learns in their course, and you could just learn it. That wasn't even an option on the table. Now, are most people going to take that option? Well, probably not. It's difficult. But I think a lot of these technologies, these tools, they widen the gap, because they allow the path of least resistance, is to just get the AI to do it for me, and I'm not going to understand it, but I'm just going to do what they're saying. But it's also this tool that, like, if I don't understand Heidegger, I can ask the AI to, like, give me explanations of Heidegger, or at least point to other people or give me sources. Like, these are things that are possible that were not possible until recently. So I do think, I made this thesis in Ultralearning that there's this divergence that, technology makes the people who are better off. It accelerates what they can learn, and it makes the people who are prone to distraction or, not learning things, it makes it easier for them to do that too.
Yeah, it reminds me of Matthew effect, I think. I don't know if you know that one.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I worry about that. Okay, related to this, but off on a slightly different tangent. I'm going to have a very hard time. I mean, I'll grant it to you, because I think analogies are really ridiculous and weak in terms of how that we think. Analogies have their place, but I'm going to still have a hard time giving up the idea that my mind and my memory is not like a muscle, because I haven't gone and done a name demonstration since the virus, right? And I know that if I go into a name demonstration now without practice, because I used to do it all the time in the community, 40, 50 names, blah, blah, blah. Like, I know that there's a weakening. So what's wrong with the analogy it would be the same, wouldn't it? If I didn't do push-ups for 3 weeks, like, it's just going to be harder. So where's the...
I mean, oh yes. Well, that is the correct part of the analogy, right? The correct part of the analogy is that, like, as we practice things, it strengthens, and as we forget to practice things, it weakens. I think where the analogy is more suspect is this idea that there is just broad faculties that are trainable through specific practice. So I make a particular criticism of brain training, because I think it is very tempting to believe that, like, well, there's something strenuous and difficult about, like, doing a Sudoku puzzle or something like this, that as I kind of put myself through that mental strain, it's just sort of sharpening my mind in the way that, we understand that, like, I go to the gym and I exercise. I don't have to do those exact movements to benefit from exercise in my general health, that there should be some sort of analogous thing to brain health, but it seems like there's not. And so my sort of, I think that the evidence much more strongly favors the idea that, like, what we're learning when we learn and what we're learning when we practice is specific procedures, specific knowledge, specific concepts, mental models. And those can be somewhat abstract. So there is the ability to transfer from one domain to another. It's not like we learn things in this, just like, you can only do this one problem when you learn that problem. Like, if you do a few problems of the same type, you generalize it to that type of problem and you learn it. But it suggests that the mind is kind of more like a toolbox. It's more like you have all these different, like, tools and gadgets in there. And that the smart and clever person is someone who has acquired a lot of tools, and they've done lots of practice so they can sort out which tools solve which kinds of situations. And so for someone like yourself who's studied memory techniques in some depth, and you have a lot of these tools at your disposal, you can encounter like an unfamiliar, let's say, mnemonic problem, and you can devise some way of memorizing it. So I don't mean to disparage that particular technique, but I don't think, absent those tools that you're using, I don't think just like, if you just read a lot in a particular domain, I don't think it would strengthen your general faculty of memory beyond maybe the super general kind of like your reading ability would improve, and maybe you're just like better able to sit down and focus for longer, these like really highly non-specific effects.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know either. I mean, the more that
I sense disagreement. Yeah.
no, it's not so much disagreement. I mean, I partly just wanted to express that I wanted to be convinced that the brain muscle analogy doesn't work. And like I said, I think analogies are quite weak myself. I try to avoid them. And obviously memory is not a muscle. There's too much going on. Some recent scientists, this is like 2 years ago now, but they were like, we got to get rid of this word memory. Like it's not sufficient to the cause of what we're trying to talk about because it's too singular, right? Just implicit memory itself is a lifetime to sort of explore. So I don't disagree with these things. I think they need to be more and more complicated, actually. But I have very few people to talk to about those things because of the way the internet works and how that people get attracted to mnemonics and so forth. But in terms of transfer effects, that's another area where I feel a little bit of instinct to push back. And I'll put it this way. This may be a line in your own book that didn't leap out at you, but it was something along the lines of appreciation for music doesn't translate to having better marketing skills. And I just thought, hang on a second. Okay, so like Frank Kern plays guitar, Eben Pagan plays guitar, and Roy Furr is a programmer of amazing music. And then I was like, Stephen King, if you would grant me the room here, owns a radio station, plays the guitar, and he shows up more than any author I've ever seen to market his books on television stations or around the place. And so then I thought, and I'm not asking anything other than this, how many examples do I need before I can say, actually, there might be evidence that there is a relationship between appreciation for music and marketing skills? Because it seems to me that I could actually, get a big number together when you think about it. In Murakami, again, he owned a jazz bar. It's just like, but again,
I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be that guy right now, but I'm going to.
But this is what science is, right? It's like, but I want to be that guy who gathers the evidence.
But it doesn't. But to me, the experiment that says one way or another what we're talking about has nothing to do with like how many examples you draw. Because like, first of all, there's definitely a case that smarter people have more intellectual interest. So I would expect naturally that people who are good at skill X are also good at skill Y because of these general factors. That's not the question. The question is, if you train a person at X, how much better do they get at Y? And I think there's some radius of this. It's not zero. It's not like, if you learn, I think even Thorndike's original experiments when he was doing like comparing the benefits of like, I don't know, Latin or geometry to other things, it wasn't like it went down to zero. Like if you learn geometry, it did help with like some other things. But what he found is that it didn't like help more than like learning bookkeeping and stuff, which suggests that it was some kind of like non-specific factor, like studying or something, as opposed to the content of that discipline. And so to me, I think like the real thing you would want to find is that if like, for instance, you think that learning to program, this is like a common one, learning to program improves your general critical thinking and problem solving skills, then like, great. Okay. We'll teach people some programming. We'll put them through some course of programming, and then we'll measure their problem solving on problems that are like, chosen so that they're not just analogous to what you've learned in a programming context. And here the research has been found wanting. Like a lot of people want to show this. It's hard to show this. Now, I don't want to say that the case is like 100% knockdown. I would say that like, if you look at the return to intelligence for years of education, which is this like super general measure. It seems like there's some sort of quasi-experimental studies where like if you get a couple years more school, you get a few more IQ points. And, is that because you spend more time in school so you get better at taking tests in this non-specific way, but it helps with IQ, but it doesn't help with like non-academic things? I don't really know. But I think definitely at the micro level of like learning a specific subject like chess or music or programming doesn't have the transfer to these sort of broad general abilities that we would like if that were true. Now, I mean, does that mean that you shouldn't learn things? Well, no, of course not, because there are lots of these overlaps. Like if you learn music and you go into marketing, yeah, well, you're going to have a good ear for jingles probably, right? Like,
well, that's one of the things I was thinking
does show up in those things, right? So it's not that that's not true. I just think, again, it goes back to what's the mental model? What's the mental model you're using for the brain? So if the mental model is that, well, it consists of these like 8 or 9 faculties, like, and they're like muscles and I train them and I get better. That's almost assuredly not how it works. And so when we have general skill, it's this toolbox metaphor. It's like, well, you have all these tools, and then sometimes this tool that you acquired in one domain just turns out to be useful in another domain. And that's like this really nice finding that you can get. Like, certainly math is like that. You learn math and then you learn some other subject and you're like, oh, it turns out it's the same math, or it's the same kind of problem. I think that can be, it's a wonderful surprise that people who educate themselves stumble into all the time. But it's not the case that, I think if you just do some kind of generic practice, it generally makes you smarter in with the caveats that I've mentioned aside.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, it raises a thing, and it's hard to frame it or to express what I'm trying to say. But when I read your book and lots of scientific studies, like I'm aware that I'm not sure I'm always understanding what exactly the study is studying, because there's a lot of counterintuitive elements to it. There's frames that they're putting around things, and then there's corrections and so forth. So, when I said all that stuff, I was just thinking, did I just say I don't like analogies and then make one? Like that's how dim that I am. And I'm also just aware that there's a certain dimness in my brain that I don't necessarily know that I understand the very studies that I'm reacting to or commenting on. So
yeah, I mean, that is a problem. I think sometimes definitely in science communication, you get into this issue where like the study showed something incredibly specific, and then you see how it's reported, and they're like, the claims are just like out of proportion with what the study actually showed. My favorite one is Dunning-Kruger, because everyone likes that. Like Dunning-Kruger, if you've at all been on the internet, the Dunning-Kruger effect is that people who this is what the effect is that people who are don't know anything are super confident. People who know a lot are like, they have low confidence in their ability. And it's like, you know what? That's not actually what the study showed. It just shows that the slope is not 1-to-1, that like people who are lower ability are overconfident, but they still think that they're worse than the people who are best. So it's just like one of those things where like you drill into the study and then you find out, oh, actually what the study was doing was like measuring people on these kind of like logic problems. And it's like, clearly the ability to evaluate whether you're getting the logic problems right is very closely related to being able to get the logic problems right. So, I mean, again, like it's sometimes you go into the weeds, you go into the mud, and you find out, oh, something that seemed really clear is getting messier underneath the surface. I mean,
that's such an interesting example. That is such an interesting example, because one of the people whose name is on that was recently on the Shrinking Trump podcast, and he himself was not particularly well representing the limits of his own theory, right? It was used.
They also do that too, right? Yeah.
Right. But the creator themselves, that you would think would not overreach it. Anyway,
I mean, people are human. Like they like to do that, right? Like they like to draw the big generalization. I believe X, and I did this study to show this. And so there's a lot of like pet topics in, especially social psychology, where people will like, draw some grandiose theory, and then they'll point to a concrete experiment that does show something. Like don't get me started on like intrinsic motivation and all that kind of stuff, because there's lots of stuff where like people bandy about, they talk about it at this high level and it's very detached from the actual research.
Yeah, well, how do I get better at science? And let me draw back to our previous discussion, because one of the things, like, I actually got nice emails from people last time about our discussion, and
Mhm.
they really liked that I pressed you on free will.
Okay.
But when it comes to getting better at science, Dennett died recently, Daniel Dennett,
Yeah.
and before he died, he was on some podcasts and he was doing things about free will. And so he would say, you shouldn't be telling people that there's no free will and blah, 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 blah. And then he would later in the interview, he would say, Mozart was Mozart and nobody else could ever be like Mozart. And I'm like, hang on a second. You're just giving the evidence for the absence of free will that you say nobody should ever say, because it's
Mm.
precisely all the conditions of Mozart's life
Yeah.
that produce this thing, and like why he can't see it. But then I'm like, what am I missing? Why am I not good enough at science that I can't even perceive why that Dennett, like what, like I'm not trying to say there's a right or wrong to it. It's just I
Yeah.
literally cannot understand why this most glorious person I admire so much, who came up with
Yeah.
Schmetz or whatever it's called, like it's
Yeah.
just this weird variation on chess Schmetz. I don't know if you ever heard of that he did, but
No,
anyway, like
no.
he's just so genius. But at some point, I
Yeah.
just can't, and I want to, like I really want to
Yeah.
see and understand, and I think it has to do with that I'm just not as good a scientist as he is or something. So how do I get
Well,
better at
I
that?
mean, Dennett is probably the philosopher that I actually like agree with the most. Like there's philosophers that I enjoy reading because they're interesting, but Dennett is one where I'm like, this person actually represents my my actual
Me
worldview
too, except
perfectly.
for the free will thing. I
Um,
can't get it.
but okay, so the free will thing. So let's talk about that because this is like totally outside of my area of expertise. But my whole thinking about the free will is, well, first of all, I think free will is like if you were like choosing concepts from scratch, you wouldn't start there, right?
Mm,
Because it has all this metaphysical baggage and associations with certain things that I think are probably wrong. So it would probably be better if we just like didn't use that term. Like it's just sort of, I don't know, it's a little bit like, I don't know, like there's a lot of terms that they just don't really correspond to, how the world is, and they're going to be misleading. And so I think free will is probably one of them.
mm,
Um, my thinking is more a choice, and just the idea that like there's this kind of, I don't know, my model of it is there's this like causal flow of the universe of like things causing other things, causes causing effects. And I'm certainly in that flow of the universe. And so in that sense, I don't think I violate the laws of physics when I make decisions for things. But as a self-reflective point of view, that's obviously, that's a like I'm not able to represent my own like at a molecular level what's going on in my own brain. I'm not able to do that. And so we have a very useful simplification, which is that, well, I make choices of things, just like based on sort of the knowledge and beliefs that are in my head, I make choices about what I'm going to do. And I think that's a very useful construct for doing it. So I think that was sort of Dennett's point about compatibilism, is that like, yes, you can say on this sort of like grand metaphysical level that like, well, no, there's nothing aphysical going on when people are thinking and consciousness and whatnot. And I think he was a real defender of that physicalist viewpoint. But he was also saying like, it totally makes sense to have this intentional stance. It totally makes sense to be like, you chose to have this podcast with me, like is maybe not like at a, atoms bouncing around in the void explanation of what's going on, but it's the only kind of explanation that you and our brains can actually like compress enough to actually process. It makes sense for me to think of you as an agent that has choices. That's a very good model. It lets me make good predictions about what you're going to do, and it also lets me make good predictions about what I'm going to do, that I have choices and I make those choices based on my beliefs. And so if I had different beliefs, I would make different choices, and the
mm,
beliefs are themselves encoded probably in my neurons and this kind of thing. But I think so. Believing that you're able to make choices, I think, is probably a correct belief to have.
mm,
Believing that those choices are caused by the physics and the universe, I think, is also true. But it's just like the latter point is a little bit irrelevant for like, well, I don't have any free will, so I shouldn't do X or shouldn't do Y. It's like, well, there's no answer to that question, because like the should or shouldn't is just implied in like whatever ends up being what happens in your brain, right?
right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. I read the Sapolsky book recently too, Determined, and it almost turned me off the topic entirely because I thought,
Mm.
okay, this is almost a political book. Like it's got
Yeah,
an
Sapolsky,
argument,
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. He's someone I feel like. I mean, I think I respect him. I think he's a good scholar and this kind of thing. But I think again, it's also same with Sam Harris. I feel like makes the same kind of point. Is that I think again, if you take the physicalism argument seriously, I just think it has less practical implications than some of these people would think. Like if you're arguing against, there's something metaphysical going on when we choose things and therefore we have free will and like it reaches outside the universe. I think it's I don't know. I feel pretty confident that that's not true. But if you were to say, well, because everything is caused by physics, therefore, and then whatever political pragmatic philosophy you spot, I just think it just doesn't follow. It's like that's the failure of the argument. It's like you have a premise and your conclusion doesn't follow from that. So if your idea is that, well, we shouldn't blame anyone for doing anything because they didn't have any free will, it's sort of like, well, no, that doesn't follow from that, right? Because it's a, social norms and blame are like an important mechanism. And same thing with like, well, you should therefore feel like you're hopeless and not make choices for things. It's sort of like, well, no, that also doesn't follow for things. Maybe it's the case that, so anyways, I just feel like if you're asking from a practical point of view, I think it's probably definitely the case that this idea that choices are a useful concept and a way of thinking about our own behavior and the behavior of other people.
Yeah, well, then it almost has me converted, as does this conversation. In any case, people appreciated our discussion about it last time, and I got a little more worried about where I might be wrong or what my intuition or whatever. It's not a right or wrong thing, but it's just like when I see the responsibility thing going and blah, 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 I don't know. But let's push it. Maybe this isn't even a free will question, but it connects in my mind. And maybe, I don't know if it's a transfer effect a question or not, but
sure.
One thing I used to do a lot, and it came to my mind while I was reading your book, Get Better at Anything. I used to get people to see a zebra in this corner, and there might be like a yellow xylophone in this corner.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, not to extend this too long, I would then ask them to just tell me the first letter of each of those words. And I would, quote unquote, trick them into reciting the alphabet backwards. And so I was thinking about this while I was reading your book, and I was just thinking, so those people very easily recited the alphabet backwards. Why have they not instantly become lifelong mnemonists who can see how that simple process just applies to whatever that they might want to remember better or commit to memory with greater accuracy, retention, etc. I mean, they would need to do spaced repetition, but nonetheless. Is that a transfer problem?
Why aren't people mnemonicists, or why did this example not inspire them to become mnemonicists? What's the crux of the question you want to ask?
Yeah, I don't know what the question is. I mean, but I was always astonished because some people would run with it for a while. Other people would say, "Yeah, I get that," but they would instantly not make a connection to how it connects to. I mean, I'll take responsibility. It's my failure as a teacher, but it was always really weird how easily that they could do that, but it doesn't necessarily, and maybe I'm misusing the transfer effect. I think I am, but it doesn't necessarily just transfer to, oh, wow, now this world of anything that's in a list, has some new potential to me.
I mean, there's few areas of academic literature that are more pessimistic than the literature on transfer. And I think part of it is not that actual transfer is impossible to find, but that one of the major problems of learning in general is that our long-term memories are these just like vast reservoirs of knowledge. Like we have so many possible memories that we could think about. And so one of the functions of the brain is not just to learn things to put them in long-term memory, but how do you get it out at the right time, right? Like how do you this is what I need in this particular instance. And for a lot of problems, that is the bottleneck. It's not learning it. It's getting it out in this situation where it's not obvious that that's the knowledge that's called for. And so I think there are ways around that. I don't want to say it's an insolvable problem, but it is a problem, right? It is a problem. And so people very often are kind of almost kind of conservative or miserly with how they draw upon knowledge to apply to it. That if there's not strong hints that X is relevant to this situation, they just won't use it. They won't attempt to see whether it fits or works. The example that everyone cites that I really like is this story. So Keith Holyoke and Mary Gick did this study about analogies. And they presented these two scenarios like side by side. So this is like as helpful as you could possibly get in like there's a relationship. Like it's not like asking you to remember something from third grade, which would be the realistic situation for applying an analogy. And they gave one story about a general attacking a fortress, and he has this army, and there's all these roads leading to the fortress, but they have these pressure sensitive mines. So if he sends the whole force down one road, it'll detonate and he'll lose. But if he sends too small a force that won't detonate, it won't be enough to overwhelm the castle and he'll lose. And the solution is you split up your force and you have it converge on the castle. And then he talks about this other story, which is that there is a stomach tumor, a cancerous tumor, and you can treat it with radiation. If you shoot a radiation that's too intense, it kills the healthy tissue, kills the patient. If you do it that's not intense enough, then it won't kill the cancerous tissue. What do you do? And it's so funny hearing, like, this is originally this Gestalt psychologist, Carl Dunker. He was the first one who did this thing. And like people have all sorts of like creative solutions to the problem. They're like, well, maybe if you like had them open their mouth and you like shoot it down the esophagus, you could like hit just the tumor, like weird things like that, or like people are coming up with. But no one thought, oh, I just learned this solution pattern in this other problem, which is very abstractly this idea of like, how do you concentrate force when you have to pass it through something where you don't want to have concentrated force, and the situation is to like break it apart and then converge. They don't apply that abstract mental model to this new problem. But very interestingly, if you tell them, oh, the general problem might help you, it's like something like 95% of people get the analogy and they make it work. So it's very clear that like where the deficit, where the weak chain in the link is not the ability to form the analogy. It's not that like they're not able to do that. It's just that it doesn't occur to them to even try. It doesn't even occur to them to like try to do that. And so, this I think has a lot of implications for learning, because we learn these subjects in school, and it's much to the chagrin of educators that like they encounter the situation. They're like, this is what I was preparing you for. And then they don't use the knowledge. They like try some other way to solve the problem. They're like the equivalent of shooting the laser down the esophagus. They do like, no, but I taught you this way that works. Why aren't you using it? And it's because it didn't occur to them to use that, So I don't know. I think there's something deep about that, about like how learning works, about how, the problem is not that we don't have the knowledge often. It's often just that it doesn't occur to us that that thing that we heard once is actually relevant to the situation.
Right. Well, in my mind, it not that anything comes down to any one thing, but just as a turn of phrase, in my mind, it comes down to a procedural memory issue in some large respect. I mean, we probably just don't go through the rungs enough for it to become second nature. So this is about, your book's not mine, but I'll briefly show you this since we don't get together very often. I'm working on this. This isn't available anyway, so don't consider it marketing. But The Mystery of the Magnetic Alphabet is one of 5 books. And this is about developing, it's an experiment. Well, parents do this with kids, the test readers and so forth. But it has a little exercise in the back, and it's trying to make them see the world as something with a lot of letters and numbers all over the place. And can we get a procedural memory thing? Now, my hypothesis is, it doesn't matter what cool things you give the kids. If the teachers aren't doing it and the parents aren't doing it, it's not going to enter implicit and procedural memory to the point that they have exactly that sort of issue. Like they're just not going to think this is a situation where I could do this thing. So I don't know if you would see it as implicit.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a component. Like I spent the transfer chapter is probably the one that I spent the most time like really trying to understand the issue of the research. And my viewpoint is that this problem occurs for a few reasons. So one is that if the procedure that you're learning is insufficiently learned, meaning not just that you maybe haven't learned it at all, but it's not learned to that level of fluency where it has a low like kind of effort cost for applying it, then people don't do it. So for instance, I might understand if I'm trying to like convert a recipe. There's this like really famous example of like this person who's trying to measure, what was it? It was like they were doing like dieting, and they were like trying to measure the amount of like yogurt or something like this. And it was 2/3, but they could only have half of that. So instead of like doing what you would have learned in school, if like do the fractions, they actually poured it out on the table and like made a circle out of it and like cut it in half. And like that was how they solved it, like physically rather than doing the algorithm. And I think in that case, it's pretty fair to say that the problem is not so much that this person does not realize that fractions are helpful here, but it's been so long since they've done fractional math that the effort cost of pouring it on the table and cutting it in half is easier and more less effort prone, error prone than doing mental arithmetic to do the fractions in their head. So that would be one thing. But the other thing, and I think the Hollyoak and Gick study really points this out, is that like in that case, the analogy was easy. It was just they didn't think of it. Is that in order to have really robust understanding of things, the models in our head have to be at least somewhat abstract. So there's a certain like, you have to be able to see a pattern that's essentially invisible in the field that you're like, oh, it's this situation. And then you can bring to bear some kind of abstract knowledge to it. So I think as you develop intellectual knowledge, you kind of develop these abstract patterns. So I mean, even in the case of like learning letters, for instance, it's kind of, you don't really appreciate it always, but like the letter G, for instance, is if you look at cursive font, capital, lowercase, like there's all these different visual, quite distinct visual manifestations of the letter G that we all learn to just like, that becomes this abstract quantity of the letter G. And so in a similar way, if you're thinking about like a conceptual domain, there's this idea of like, I don't know, like evolution by, natural selection is this mental model that like you learn it in biology, but maybe you don't think about it in terms of like computer viruses, or like you don't think about it in terms of like some of these other contexts automatically because, the domain is different, but it is the same underlying model. And the reason that most people can't do it is they learn it in that one context. It's associated with all those concrete cues. They don't have an abstract picture of it. So in order to be able to like have this robust knowledge, you'd have to probably see it many different instances. So you'd be like, oh, these are all the same thing, just the same way you see all the different letter G's and realize they're the same thing. And that's how you do it. So that's my theory of like what you'd have to do to invoke this kind of transfer.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. Controversy. So
okay.
There's a controversial thing in here, not to me, but
okay.
Copying. I thought this idea would strike controversy. Maybe it won't, but I mean, ChatGPT has scraped us all and blah, blah, blah. So maybe not. But the thing that came to mind was, I don't know where I heard it.
Yeah.
I think I was 14, 15, something like that. But somebody just said, copy another book and you'll learn how to write. And so I got out Camus and copied a couple pages of The Stranger. Yeah. And is that the explanation for why I've managed to make it as a independent entrepreneur? Or I don't see any sense of Camus in my writing, but I did that exercise, and I think it made an impact.
So this is an area where I think the kind of prevailing wisdom is that like copying creativity or copying and originality are like worlds apart. I think something probably owes back to the kind of the Enlightenment and, the Romantic movement, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all these thinkers that just sort of saw the scholastic tradition, this idea of like, you were just sort of building on this edifice of other people's knowledge and not really looking to nature, and the rejection of that idea. You have all these kind of, as a consequence, all these pedagogical notions of like, that's the wrong way to do things. We should be thinking for ourselves. We should be creative. We should be original. And I think you can see that in like, there's some residue of that in a lot of our, a lot of different subjects in school. Like, we don't want people to copy. We want people to create. And like, if you withhold the ability to copy, that we're going to get more originality. And I think that that's not universal. Like in most cultures, it's been the opposite, that they've really emphasized copying. Like if you look at the sort of the Vedic tradition in like ancient India and stuff, there's this enormous emphasis on verbatim memory of these hymns. In like ancient China, there's like, it was, you're doing these entrance exams and it was essentially like how well do you know these classics? Like you should know them like inside and out and all this kind of thing. So it really is like the Western culture where we kind of took this right turn at some point. And I don't think that it's entirely wrong. Like you can definitely get stuck at a level where you're just copying something, but copying is a very important function. It really rests on this human talent of like the ability to see how someone else has done something and extract lessons from it is something that really only human beings can do and what we're uniquely good at. And so for your writing example, I think just copying one author would probably leave some residue on your style. Like if you do retain anything, it would kind of like get you to write things in a certain way that, maybe is not so healthy for your style. But copying 10 people, well, now you see all these possibilities. You have learned all these moves of how you solve particular problems, certain writing challenges. And I think this ability to do this is very important for creative education, because if you want to create something truly original, it's almost invariably the people who have well studied what exists out there that produce something original, because they understand, of the entire sequence, which bit you can flip and make something that's totally new.
Mm.
Whereas the people who are like unstudied, it's not that they produce something totally original, but they often end up kind of like sort of badly reinventing something that someone else had already done. That usually is what the case is. It's not like, oh, this thing is groundbreaking because they were untainted by the influence of other people. No, it's usually the case that you just like did a bad version of what someone did 300 years ago and you just didn't realize it. So
Right.
I tend to think that copying is very important.
Yeah, I don't suppose it would count as a scientific example, but for your research in the future, you may find this very fascinating. Kenneth Goldsmith, I don't know, you know that guy? Uh, Pittsburgh,
Sounding
maybe.
familiar. To explain it to me a little bit more, yeah.
So he had the School of Uncreativity. Anyway,
Oh, okay.
during the Obama administration, he was invited to the White House. And it's one of the most amazing videos I've ever seen in my life, because he takes the copying one step further. And his School of Uncreativity, he assigned his students exactly that they must plagiarize and they must
Yeah.
copy something. But and he himself, I think it's called Daybreak or something like this. He
Yeah.
copied the entire New York Times on 9/11 or something like that. Like he typed out the whole
Yeah.
thing and
Yeah.
published it as a book. Anyway, the whole thing in his assignment was, where I think it is the step further, is they had to write an essay that justifies the choice of what they would plagiarize.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's
Anyway,
interesting. I mean,
he was invited to the
yeah.
White House for what it's worth, so maybe that's not a scientific reference, but it's
Yeah.
one of the most. When you look at the people and the expressions on their face when he's explaining
Yeah.
this, it was wild.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think there's definitely like I do think again you can. I'm not sure whether the approach of like slavishly copying is always healthy. Like as I said, I think the Enlightenment thinkers did get something right, that if you're just unthinkingly copy from the past tradition because the past tradition is correct, and there's a certain um, obedience there in doing that. That's not always healthy intellectually, but I do think it's the case that when you're like, think about even the most outrageous creative acts, they're usually from people that they've absorbed so much of the culture, they've gotten to that frontier that like they understand which rules, if you broke, you would create something original versus which ones you'd have to keep flipped. There's this cultural critic, I think his name is Robert Trivers. I'm maybe forgetting his quote, but I was reading this in this book about art in the Cold War by Louis Menand, the New Yorker writer, and he talks about how Trivers was sort of like commenting on a lot of the kind of avant-garde, postmodernist kind of artists at the time when we're talking about like the 50s and 60s, of sort of like, but yes, but you can only really do this, like your rebellion to like everything that is like standard is itself kind of like predicated on what is standard, right? Like the only way you can be John Cage and have the music that is just like 4 minutes of silence is
Mm.
in this tradition where you're like, that's something that stands out, right? Otherwise it's nothing at all. And so
Mm.
I think that's something that, so even like I talk about the Renaissance artists, which are very much a case where you have established motifs, and it is sort of very traditional in that sense. But I could have written a part of that chapter about like, very modern art and how, you look at Pablo Picasso and like his early work is very traditional. And part of what he's doing is a rejection of that. But in order to reject it, you have to know what you're rejecting, right? Like it doesn't come from nothing, right? And so I
Mm.
think that's something that even if you were aiming for radical creativity, there would be a certain amount of learning in the discipline that you would have to do.
Yeah, well, you talk about jazz, and I was thinking about Anthony Braxton,
Mm.
which doesn't come up in your book, but when
Yeah.
you, I don't know if you know him, but it's kind of in jazz. You have the impulse to not repeat, right? It's not
Yeah.
exactly not copying because
Yeah.
you have to know what if you're doing 257 or whatever it's going to be, and you got you need to know when the turnaround is coming, and like there is a formal part of jazz, but then there is don't copy what you did last night, which you basically said
Yeah. Yeah.
you have the quote, I think not from Miles
Yeah.
Davis,
From
but
Mingus. Yeah.
Mingus, yeah,
Mingus. Yeah.
you
Charles
played the
Mingus.
same thing last night and the
Yeah.
night
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Mingus is a good example here,
Yeah.
because he was one of more of the radical, more out there sort of people. But that's not copying, but it is, and it isn't, and it's in this other sort of area. But I thought of
Yeah.
Anthony Braxton because the level, like needing to know things like, what are they called? It'll come to me in a second, maybe. But there's this like level on, it's like meta jazz, hexaphonic,
Yeah.
limited hexaphonic transpositions. That's the term that I'm looking for. And like
Mm.
concepts like maximum angularity and all this sort of
Yeah.
stuff. So there's
Yeah.
like, it almost like is recursive
Yeah.
because it's not copying, but it is copying because it's copying category.
Yeah.
It's becoming meta, and there's like it's almost like the Zen thing again. Like there's no language to say the thing, but
Yeah.
it's no longer just the music. It's the thinking about the music that then conditions the music. So the
Yeah.
production, and you mentioned John Cage. It's like where is the another way of thinking about this? I don't know if you know Christian Book. He would be maybe on your radar as in Canada, the Xenotext project, where he got a grant from Canada to take bacteria, inject them with code that had a poem inside of it. Like I don't know
Mm.
exactly how the science works, but
Yeah.
you know how you can inject like a
Yeah.
dictionary
Right.
into a
Right.
cell, that kind of thing. So he
Yeah.
created a poem in such a way that like X over here is, or Z over here is represented by A or whatever. Anyway, really nice
Yeah.
poetry. It didn't work, but the theory was that could you get two cells with two poems in them to interact and then create a new poem, right?
Mm.
And so when I read the
Yeah.
Xenotext project, the poems that were injected into the living matter, they're glorious. They're really great poetry,
Yeah.
but they're still just poetry. So I thought,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to diminish it that way, but I thought
Yeah.
the real poem is that he got a $100,000 grant and he wrote,
Yeah.
because that's where poetry is, right? Like it's
Yeah.
so, I don't want to say postmodern, but it is like,
Yeah.
who cares about painting? That's red on a wall. Let's reflect on red on a wall. So it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Well, I do think that, like, speaking just about art, a major factor, again, it's not something I chose to touch on in the book, but part of it was also that, like, the reason that art is different now than it was, not even all going all the way back to like the Renaissance, but like even just the academy system, is that the level of technical virtuosity had reached this sort of like asymptote where it kind of was like, well, but we're like the people who are painting things are doing them kind of, I don't want to say perfectly, but like it's sort of the limit of that style, right?
Mm.
And so you have people who have this sort of conceptual turn because it's sort of like, well, there's no more you can do there. Like you've kind of done it the best that you can do. So you have to do something different. And so then you see a lot of the modern art, which is like rejecting some of those stylistic standards. And then the postmodern art, which is like rejecting the idea that like art is about the image at all. And what was it? It was a Duchamp who said something like was it the tyranny of the eye? I'm trying to get that right. But I feel like, I feel like, again, it would have been too much of a digression to put it in the book. But this idea that, especially when you consider a lot of the copying as not being just sort of like a procedural skill, but also conceptual about background knowledge, like you can see these things, they are kind of in some ways natural evolutions of the same sort of like, this is the milieu of what exists, and I'm going to flip one of these bits. I'm going to like, instead of doing this, I'm going to do this other thing, and that's going to be unexpected. But it's going to be unexpected precisely because it exists in this art context where people already understand why. So when you change one thing, it does strike them as new and not just nonsense,
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of nonsense, there's a great Canadian band, No Means No. They have
Okay.
a line. They have two lines that always come to my mind. nonsense is better than no sense at all is one of them. And
Mhm.
I really believe all these things I say to you are true. No, I really believe all of these things I say to you. It's just that none of them are true. Um, so get better at anything. I was thinking
Yeah.
that's just such a massive promise.
Yeah.
And all I want to get better at are things that are not things. So
Yeah. Okay.
one, I'll give you two avenues, and then we'll maybe have a nice wrap up point. The
Hmm.
first thing that came to mind when I was thinking, okay, so what is a thing anyway, and what is anything? But then when I thought of the things that I really want to get better at, I memorized, you mentioned the Vedas. I memorized a ton of Sanskrit for one of my research projects because
Hmm.
I couldn't understand the Zen. I couldn't understand
Yeah.
like non-duality or anything. Like even though I did philosophy in university, it was just like, what are these guys talking about? So
Yeah.
somebody told me that if you memorize there's a guy named Gary Weber. He said that he memorized all the Sanskrit and he turned his thoughts off. I'm like, BS, right? But my friend said, well, you're an eminist. So
Yeah.
1,700 words of Sanskrit later, I'm in the park and my thoughts turn off. And I have this weird, um, what do you call it?
Yeah.
Ineffable experience.
Mm.
And then I was
What do you
reading,
call it? Ineffable. Yeah.
well, what else? I mean, I don't want to make any claims about anything because I don't know what happened,
Right. Right.
and I got a 3 pound brain and I'm aware of it.
Yeah.
But the problem is how do I get better at it? Because it's not a thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, And one line of thinking, I think his name is Guy Fufeng. He was Alan Watts's favorite translator, apparently. And Guy
Yeah.
Fufeng apparently had this habit of yelling out of nowhere or whatever. Like people would come into his little Zen place or whatever, and they would have a bad thing to say to him or whatever. And he would say, "Of course I'm a charlatan." And I was just thinking, I don't want to
Yeah.
be a charlatan, and I don't think that I am, but I think that I am so
Yeah.
damn close. Like I'm on the razor's edge
Yeah.
sometimes because I now have these experiences. So how do I get better at not being a charlatan,
Yeah.
but still exploring these wonderful worlds that were closed to me because I had my head up my butt and I was like, if it isn't in a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
I don't want to do it. That's the one thing
Yeah,
that is not
meditation
a
is an
thing.
interesting one. Yeah, like I didn't touch on it. And I mean, obviously the book title Get Better at Anything. I mean, clearly most of the book is about learning cognitive
Mm.
skills. So I mean, there's just a lot of things that I don't touch. So in some sense, yeah, then the title is a little bit of a it's overly broad compared to what is actually in the book. Like I'm mostly talking about like how do you learn skills are things that I consider to be skills, whereas there's lots of non-skill things that one could want to get better at, and I don't really touch on them. Um,
But I wonder if
but I
my
think,
my concern to not go off the deep
yeah,
end isn't a
yeah.
skill that I'm looking for.
Well, so I think it's interesting. Like I don't boast any particular meditative insight, and so I'm sure there's people who have spent a lot longer that would maybe say yes or no. But in some ways, I think meditation, especially in this sort of Zen sense, is almost an anti-skill that like kind of when you like let's say you're doing some breathing thing and you're like trying to pay attention to your own breath or whatever. Our brain is designed to avoid doing that, right? Our brain is
Mm.
designed to like you're really paying attention to something. It's like, okay, I'm gonna find a way to like do this with low effort so I can turn back on the default mode network and think about something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what we're designed to do. So like you start driving a car and you're really like absorbed by it because it's like taking all your attention. And then you go for a while and then, after a while of driving your car, you're thinking about other things. You're not thinking about driving because it's unless there's some, exigent situation, you don't think about it. That is how our brain is designed. So in some ways, this meditative like mindfulness of like being aware of what you're thinking or what you're doing is like trying to go reverse in the skill direction. Like you're trying to undo what you naturally do of
Mm.
like freeing up yourself to have like daydreams and self-directed thoughts and whatnot. So I don't know. I'm not sure there's a right way to do it, but it is an interesting kind of puzzle that you have that like as you practice doing your breath, you're trying to in some ways not learn it. You're trying to in some ways make it seem like it's the first time you're doing it, that it's like absorbing your attention and that it's interesting and that it's like you're not just like, oh yeah, meditation, now time to daydream about whatnot, right? Like that's
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
really hard. So I don't have an answer to that problem, but it was something that I thought about when I was going through the research, that it's sort of like mindfulness isn't it feels to me in some ways like an anti-skill. It's the opposite of a skill.
Yeah. Well, I can see that. Although when you get more into breathing, I mean, everybody's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, Wim Hof," but I'm just like, dude, I was pouring cold water over my head before he was a thing, because I did Systema, and Systema
Yeah.
teaches
Yeah.
2 times a day, cold bucket over your head, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's Kapalabhati and Kumbaya, like you can get
Hmm.
so granular into breathing that it's not even funny. Like it makes
Yeah.
no shade to Wim Hof, but it's like
Yeah.
he has this very super simplified thing of an ancient tradition that has so many
Yeah.
variations. There is a form of yoga that they literally think in this form of yoga about where the celestial bodies are and what hand they're going to link their breath to when they open the door. It's like feng shui times 1,000, right? Swara yoga, it's called, I believe, if memory serves. Anyway, I get like super interested in this, but the skill I'm thinking of is like, how do I not go off the deep end? And then I wonder too, right? Well, imagine
Hmm.
just virtue signaling to my fellow scientists because I don't want them to like that wouldn't be the
Yeah.
enlightenment I'm seeking for if I really cared what anybody thought, right?
Yeah.
Or would it? So like meditation has gone so wild that Cheetah House had to be formed. I don't know if you know this, but people are having enlightenment experiences, and I went through it myself. Like it is so alarming that
Hmm.
it's like Dark Night of the Soul. You're like,
Hmm.
everything is emptiness and everything is form. Oh, I'm going to go insane. So
Yeah.
Cheetah House
Yeah.
has to form to help people make sure that they don't go completely nuts because they've had an
Yeah.
awakening, right? Whatever that is. So I do think that it may be an anti-skill in the meditation thing, but I worry
Yeah.
about the skill of how you're going to save yourself because let me put it the most blunt way possible. I am not a nihilist, but I think I'm very, very lucky that I have seen that emptiness and I can come out with a
Yeah.
smile because I went through 2 weeks where I was just like, this is it. Like, what am
Yeah.
I doing here? Like, there's no reason
Oh, yeah.
behind anything. And it's,
I don't know whether it's exactly the same thing because I know a lot of meditative experiences or things in that kind of phenomenological tradition are they're more subjective experiences than like knowledge theories. So I don't want to draw that false equivalency, but
mm,
I feel like there's something kind of related when I think you learn a new subject that talks about things and gives you persuasion that like kind of the intuition that you have about things is wrong. So I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit like the research on like physics misconceptions that like we have all these intuitions about like how the physical world works, and it really does not work that way, you
right,
know.
right.
And so I think there's this, I think in some ways, like when I was a teenager and I like to read like these kind of like popular books about like physics, like Stephen Hawking or I remember reading some of Brian Greene's books and stuff, even though string theory is probably not true. But like some of this stuff back in the day, and it was just to have that same kind of vertiginous experience of just sort of like everything is a lie kind of thing. But I think that that's just part of learning, right? Like I think just we kind of get equipped with a sort of naive version of the world, and both in our explicit beliefs and like kind of maybe phenomenologically how we attend to things and how we interpret our experience. And so, it's a little bit like we were talking about free will. I think part of the problem is just that like it's a little bit like quantum mechanics when you have like you see people discussing quantum mechanics that don't know any of the physics or they don't know any of the math. It's like you're trying to wrap your head around it, but you're not getting the idea, like because it's just you're trying to apply some intuition on it that it just doesn't fit. And so I
Mm,
think there's lots of things in life that are kind of like that where the only way you can really understand it is to build this sort of alternative scaffolding of knowledge, and then just eventually you become proficient enough with it that you can understand it. And so I don't know. I think that's probably true for worldviews and conceptual understandings as well. That like, the kind of the way things is profoundly strange. It is like weird. It is like you said, like this kind of like well, everything is void. Like I mean, that is a kind of like it is a kind of crazy experience to have something like that. And I think I don't know. I mean, maybe that's my motivation for being interested in learning in the first place, just because I think that those things are out there, right? That there is these moments where you encounter something and it just opens you up to a world that like you never saw it that way before. And it's just like you're looking at the same things, but they look totally different. And I
Mhm.
think that's a very powerful experience.
Well, to bridge into the other thing that is not a thing that I really want to get better at, but it really is not a thing. You know, I live in a weird, strange world where, speaking of physics, I can say words like Yang-Baxter equation and the Dirac equation, and I can rattle off how uh, Roger Penrose in The Road to Reality says
Mm-hmm.
fractions shouldn't be so hard. Like I can say all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff because I've memorized it, but I'll be the first
Yeah.
guy to tell you that I don't know a damn thing about physics, right? And the thing that I want to get good at is YouTube, but it's not a thing. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
dynamic process. And I feel like, well, I admire you very much for landing quote unquote legacy publishing
Mm-hmm.
opportunities and doing what you do with it. I don't know why I'm exactly shut out of this world. I mean, I just had a scientific book chapter rejected, and I won't just take it as it is, but it's a little bit weird to me that it got rejected. Anyway, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm just this is like the theme of my life. I mean, I had a Mercator grant, uh, but I never managed to go further than that in terms of traditional
Mm-hmm.
academic things. I don't really know why. I mean, is it my long hair? I wasn't memorizing Sanskrit back then. I was like doing reader response theory and looking at
Mm-hmm.
spreadsheets, like all this kind of stuff. In terms of film industry statistics and how books get published and all like really granular, noodly stuff. But when it comes to YouTube, there's like a game that is mysterious to me, and I know you're a
Yeah.
YouTuber as well. So, how do you get better at a thing that is constantly
Yeah.
shifting, changing, and we
Yeah.
have to, in order to compete, we basically have to follow the signals. We kind of have to copy them,
Yeah.
and like as I understand it, the way that I could make this interview perform better would be some stupid thing like Metivier destroys Young with alternative facts and woo woo, and then like all of a sudden, and I don't want to do that. Like I
Yeah.
literally don't want to
Yeah.
be that guy,
Mm-hmm.
but everything's an experiment. Well, this
Yeah.
thumbnail or this title, like,
Yeah.
how do you get better at a thing like that?
Well, okay. So first of all, I mean, I can't boast any particularly great YouTube success. So you got to take everything I say with a
Still, I
grain of salt
mean,
here. I think for me, like for YouTube, I'm also in the same position as you in that. Well, first of all, I'm primarily a writer, and so
mm,
YouTube, I'm very aware that like to really succeed at YouTube, I would have to make it a priority that I just don't. And so like when some people say, you should do this and this and this. And it's sort of like, yeah, but then I'm gonna have to hire like 6 guys and make this my primary thing, and I'm not sure that I want to do that. So that's just me being honest. I focus on my writing. And then I think there's also this fact that like sometimes the thing that seems like is what you got to do to succeed is not what you want to do. And I mean, I even feel that with writing books. Like, I mean, we can go into this separately, but I feel like in the learning space, one of the things that I really derive from reading a lot of the research is that a lot of the things that would be really exciting if they were true are not true. And so you could definitely be like, well, but if I'm going to just optimize for making my book as appealing as possible to people who don't know enough to fact check me, there's definitely some low hanging fruit I left on the table there.
right.
I got a criticism from this last book where there was a few places where I was being a little bit ambivalent, I guess you could say, like, well, this, but on the other hand, and they didn't like that. They would rather I be more like, decisive and confident. But at the same time, I also felt like, but then it would be a less honest book. And I'm sorry, like, I mean, like, then if I did that, if I were just like, oh, I'm going to just make up my mind, this is right and ignore this other stuff, I feel like I would be misleading you because you're not going to read those things. And like, I want to give you the full perspective. So, I mean, I think that's also one of the things you do as a creator. I've met a lot of people who they're very smart and they're not the most popular. And it's because they've deliberately made choices in how they promote their content that doesn't optimize for that goal. So I think that's totally fine as well in this idea of what better is. To me, I do not consider selling the most books to be the metric for measuring publishing success. I think you probably want to sell some. You want to be able to like pay for your family and have a loyal audience. But I would much rather write books that like, that was really good. That really helped me rather than, well, I know they don't know, but like a lot of this stuff is BS. So that's part of it. And then
Mm.
I think also with YouTube, and you're talking about a moving target, I really get the impression that there's actually quite a bit of knowledge about how it works and what you need to do to succeed that is not widely held. So to go back to my original point about learning from other people, I mean, I don't know as much about YouTube as I do other areas, but like traditional book publishing is just one of the most opaque fields there is. So like when I talk to people who have not published a book and they're thinking about it, it's just clear that like no one really understands how it works. They don't understand what they need to do to be successful. But I'm lucky because I have a lot of friends that have published books and they can tell me like, this is what you got to do and you got to do this kind of thing. And so I think YouTube is kind of the same. Like I've known people that they like, they just study under some successful YouTuber and they like learn the process. They're like, oh yeah, this is how you got to you script the videos and do the thumbnails and do all that kind of stuff, even if it's not maybe what you would be inclined to do naturally. So I don't know. I'm not sure whether we're going to grow our YouTube channel that much, but I feel like if I wanted to make it a priority and I wanted to focus on it, I mean, that would be my starting point would be to like, talk to my friends who have big YouTube channels and be like, what am I doing wrong? What do I need to like focus on? And I'd probably get some advice and some of it I wouldn't want to hear.
Well, maybe give me some peer mentoring on this situation.
Yeah.
Because I know how the big publishing industry works, and I kind of partly choose not to pursue it. I admire people who do it, but I have a book that I got a developmental editor on through Reedsy. She said to me, please, 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 please submit this to publishers. And she said, this chapter should go to this journal first and this chapter to that journal first and so forth. So I was just like, this is such nonsense. Like no one is going to publish my weird, strange book about all these breathing exercises that I did to follow up on like this TEDx talk that I gave, which strangely got millions of views. And because I was talking about memorizing Sanskrit and people didn't understand the second part of it. So that's where it got so many comments, I think. So I made a whole book about it. And she's like, you gotta try, you at least have to try. So then I was like, okay. And I was telling my wife even about it. And she's like, well, what do you have to do? And I was like, well, you got to spend a lot of time getting email addresses of agents. And she's like, well, I'll help. So she got me this. Anyway, what surprised me is I only emailed 6 agents. 2 of them got back to me. One of them wanted to see the entire book. Right.
Yeah.
And both of one saw a sample, one saw the entire book. Both of them said, well, this isn't quite right for me. The one guy said, I think it'll be a tough sell. He's right. It will be a tough sell. It's a weird book. But here's my question to you. I do a little analysis in my mind. Maybe I don't even understand what Bayesian analysis is, but I'm just like, okay, so if my batting average is out of 6 agents, I'm going to hear back from 2. One of them actually wants to see the whole book. The other wanted to see a sample. If I persist at this, it's just going to be the same thing. It's just going to be, yes, I'll get interest because I know how to write it. I know how to write a proposal. I had Barbara Oakley even help me on one years ago, right? So like, I know the game, but I think that it's just going to get rejected over and over again because that first agent who said this will be a tough sell, he's right. I already know it's a tough sell. The only reason why I know it is because I wrote it for people who are on my email list and I know exactly what they'll respond to. So I can sell it easy, but I know the market wouldn't be. So how would you do that? Would you persist? Am I thinking wrong?
I mean, I don't know. No, I like personally, I feel like traditional publishing is overrated. I mean, I think like for me, I felt like for Ultralearning and then also this book, there was like I had a desire to do it. But I mean, most of the stuff I do is self-published, and self-published is just like so much easier. And especially if you're like also trying to make a living off of it. I mean, the amount of copies you have to sell of a traditionally published book for it to be like, well, the money you're making from the book is like, oh, great. Like I can live off of this is staggeringly high compared to other domains. And so I think, probably most people shouldn't do a traditionally published book. I feel like people who are insiders in this business also know that. Like even people, I don't know, I won't name names, but like I'm a part of a little WhatsApp group with some other authors, and some of the people were talking about how like, even though their book was successful and that they sold a lot of copies, that like they think it was maybe actually a net negative because it like hurt them in some other ways. And so I don't want to say that like no one should publish a traditional book, and I also think traditional book publishing can be can be really good for like, having conversations like this one. It's a way of like taking your ideas and putting it in a package that people easily understand and relate to. And I think also going through traditional publisher, um, it enforces a little bit of conformity too in some ways. Like it's a little bit like getting the degree versus like self-educating. Like you're sort of proving, okay, I'm normal enough to get this book published, which is, not like it kind of excludes a lot of really wacky and weird kind of things. But I mean, yeah, I don't think most things should be books. I think it's probably better if you're like, you know what, yeah, if this is going to be a hard sell to the publisher, then like just don't do it. Like if you have something that's like the magnetic memory method and you're going to teach mnemonics or something, and like you're clearly an expert on this, like yeah, maybe that's like a more down the middle book, and that's the one to pitch. And if you want to have like something that's going to be like zany and your list is going to like it and it's fun, then yeah, do it self-published. Because I don't know, I like self-published stuff. I like doing things on my own. That's always sort of my bias. I feel like it's more fun often than
Right,
working with
right.
the publisher. But I mean, there are some projects that I think they do benefit from that. And so yeah, you just have to choose which ones you want to do. But that's again, like it's not a like I think this whole myth that like you have to have a big book deal, like that's the mark of success. I don't know. I don't think that that's true.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of problems with it, but like I wonder what my motivations are because I really don't need it. But then the reason why I don't need it has to do with the algorithms, and it's just like, so maybe
Yeah.
I would have been wiser to invest in writing proposals and sending emails that I didn't really want to do. Anyway, I know there's no easy answer to it, but um,
Yeah.
it's
It's very hard to write a book you don't want to write, though. I think that's the like that
yeah,
would be a big takeaway I'd have from doing it, is that like if you want to write a book and you want to go with the traditional publisher, you got to really want to do it, because there's gonna be a lot of obstacles to doing it. And so if it was sort of like, I don't really feel like doing it, that's probably also itself a good sign not to do it. Because I
yeah.
mean, even if you do get it published and it becomes a bestseller, I mean, it's just like, and I know people that are very successful. Again, I won't name names, but they're very successful. They could easily write a book that would be a #1 New York Times bestseller. They would easily be able to get like a 7-figure book deal. And they're like, no, I don't like writing books. Like, I don't want to do that. So, I
Yeah.
mean, that's just a choice that people make.
Well, I could talk forever, but by way of
Yeah,
wrapping up for now until the next book,
sure.
what do you have in your mind to do better the next time around? And what
For book
ideas do you,
writing?
yeah, or
Yeah,
I myself am a writer and I just happen to use YouTube because it helps
yeah,
make it
yeah,
possible to do that. And I actually kind of love the YouTube. Like
yeah,
I have a deep love for at least a period in history, and I sort of keep that in my mind. And it's like a
yeah.
symbolic libation to my love of writing in light, let's say, as they used
Yeah.
to say in 1895. But yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, how are you going to do better if you want to in the next book? Are
Mhm.
you going to do a next book? And how do you think you're going to
Yeah.
contend with AI and the turbulence that people like you and I have on the internet
I don't know. I
in general?
think I think in terms of the product, I think I would like to do something different for the third book. I feel like to me, I take each project one thing at a time. So I think when I write a book is going to be when I'm thinking, what I really like if a book existed that was like this, and I'd like to be the one to write it. So that's usually how it starts. I think also, I think one of the things that I would also do is, in some ways, I learned something about myself when I was writing this book, because I had some issues where I'd gotten the book deal and I was still trying to figure out exactly how the ideas came together. And I realized that some people work really well under like the external pressure, but I'm someone who has like enough internal pressure that the external pressure just ends up being like a distraction. Like I don't enjoy it. And so I think if I were working on a third book, I would probably, I don't want to say I would like finish writing the book before I pitch it, but I would definitely get closer to that point. And that was just sort of a learning experience for me, that like I'd rather do more of the ideation, more of the like background research, like just have things like, okay, yeah, this is exactly what I want to publish, kind of before I get the publisher involved. Especially also because we now live in a world where like the backup option of self-publishing has gotten so good that it's not like you're taking a huge risk doing something like that. So I think
Mm.
that's probably where I would lean. But in terms of like actually the what of what I would write about, I'm still very open to that. I like to just get enthralled in projects and like, okay, I want to work on this, and then just like throw myself into it. So I have to wait for that spark.
Well, there's certainly a lot in the world to be enthralled by, and thanks for adding quality things. I follow your emails every time and
Oh, thank you.
always love the uniqueness of them, both in terms of the thinking and the research and the drawings and so forth. So,
Thank you.
where can people find you between now
Yeah.
and the next book, and where do you want people to go to find this one?
Sure. So yeah, scotthyoung.com. I've got thousands of free articles there. There's links to both the books. There's podcasts. You can find everything there. Also, yeah, the books Get Better at Anything, and of course, Ultralearning, which we talked about last time. You can get them at Amazon, Audible, wherever you get your books from. I think they even have the new one on Spotify now. So some people have a premium Spotify account. You get a few ebooks with that. So you can even
Sweet.
check that out as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Scott, and look forward to whatever you come up with next on the blog, the emails, next book, etc. Thank you for
No,
the
thank you
time.
so much. Thank you so much.
I want to thank Scott again for talking with us about Get Better at Anything. And again, I recommend Ultralearning if you haven't read that as well. It's a great complement. They work nicely together, and I look forward to what Scott comes up with next. Now, I mentioned that there's a little bit of housekeeping. Very briefly, I've got a book that I am recently working on and about to release that I hope is better in what I try to do, which is called The Memory Advantage. And it's got 52 memory exercises in it. And one of the things that I thought of is, how can I do more better things, unique things that aren't already out there in the world? And this is my answer to that. So pay attention to my emails if you're subscribed over there, because that's going to be launched very, very soon. And I would love to hear how that it works better for you, because that's one of the number one things I think people have told me over the years is, how can you spread these things out so you have memory activities for your daily life, your weekly life, etc. And this is my proposed solution. And these exercises all combined follow the rules of having a lot of variety, a lot of challenge, always new learning, and consistency. So you have this program, so to speak, and there are instructions on how to keep a memory journal. And I think it's going to be a very, very impactful program for people. So that's the Memory Advantage, and you can get in touch if you can't find the links. It won't be on Amazon or anything like that, just directly through my program for my subscribers. So what else? There's so many details going on at all times, but basically I'm still working on Vitamin X, which is the sequel to Flyboy, hoping to have another memory detective game. Sometimes people say, when is the game taking place? The first game took place some time ago, and the replay version is even more fun than being there live, some people say, because they have had the benefit of both. So if you have it, get in the game. It's there in your login area. The next game, I'm not sure that Vitamin X will come with a game, but I have most of it designed and hope to really make it awesome. And I test these games before they go out. There's another game that I've designed and is not quite ready to go out either. I'm going to try a second version of it. But nonetheless, that's basically all the housekeeping that I've got. And yeah, if you want to check out the earlier interview with Scott Young, that's there for Ultralearning, or the previous interview we did on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, which was with Luc Ranieri about his mission to memorize 100 lines of the Iliad in ancient Greek. And that interview has turned out to be quite popular. And we talk about Latin and his amazing, he's been on the Vatican radio speaking Latin, and he's very, very good at that language. So I don't know how he is going to do better in his future work, but that's here on the YouTube channel somewhere. A button perhaps will show up where you can click on the screen to watch that next. Until next time I release something new, I think what I'm going to do in the near future is just do better. I don't know what that's going to be, but always get better and better and better still. And I thank you for being part of this project and this mission, whether you're listening to the podcast in audio or watching on video. Thank you as always. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.